Thank you, Laura. As was mentioned, I'm Heidi Klepin. I'm a geriatric oncologist and clinician researcher at Wake Forest School of Medicine, and it's a privilege to be here. And I also do not have any conflicts to disclose today. To meaningfully increase enrollment of older adults on clinical trials, specific actions from key stakeholders were recommended during the workshop with a focus on planning for enrollment, removing barriers to eligibility, enhancing opportunity, engaging experts, and ensuring representation. Specifically, recommendations were made for FDA to work with sponsors to outline development plans for new drugs to enroll representative numbers of older adults. Sponsors should implement the ASCO FDA Friends of Cancer Research eligibility criteria recommendations for organ dysfunction, concurrent malignancy, and comorbidities. Sponsors should open more trials in community settings to enhance access for patients where they live. Sponsors should work with social and behavioral scientists, patients and patient advocates, geriatricians, and geriatric oncologists to consider the needs of older adults when designing clinical trials. And the NCI should implement the NIH inclusion across the lifespan policy with the goal of increasing representation of older adults so that trial populations match the population affected. Strategies to collect more information on treating older adults from clinical trials focused on the importance of expanding clinical trial outcomes and designing trials specifically for older adults. Recommendations were for sponsors and researchers to work with statisticians to design trials with co-primary or composite endpoints, including elements of geriatric assessment and patient-reported outcomes that are important to older adults. FDA and NCI should work with sponsors to design trials that collect more information on treating older and frail adults, with an emphasis on older adult-specific trials, alternative trial designs, and characterization of the patients that are enrolled on trials, with an emphasis on gathering data specifically on comorbidity and functional status. Action item 3, to expand the use of real-world data for older adults, several goals were identified. The need to identify and facilitate the unique contributions of real-world data to fill evidence gaps, the need to enhance the quality of EHR data to support evidence generation, and the importance to improve EHR systems to facilitate data collection. And there were some specific action items recommended for geriatric oncology researchers to work with ASCO, FDA, and other stakeholders to develop a framework for use of real-world data in clinical research, and to propose demonstration projects through CancerLink and other data sources. Clinicians should incorporate geriatric assessment into clinical care and record this information in the EHRs, and payers should reimburse for this time, and quality metrics programs should assess clinicians' performance. And finally, developers of large EHR databases should partner with vendors to ensure that geriatric assessment elements so necessary for research in older adults can be entered into EHRs as standard data elements. And finally, there was a clear recognition of the need to strengthen collaboration between stakeholders to develop advocacy and policy solutions. And 2 specific action items were recommended. First, and very broadly, that the geriatric oncology community should strengthen its advocacy efforts to be more cohesive and propose specific policy solutions. Second, geriatric oncologists should discuss with developers of value frameworks how their definitions of value could be updated to consider the representativeness of the evidence to the population with the disease. Several additional developments since the dissemination of the ASCO FDA workshop recommendations are very important to highlight in the context of these discussions. First, the FDA issued a draft guidance to industry on inclusion of older adults in cancer clinical trials. This is a critically important document to facilitate representation of older adults on registration trials. Second, there are continued efforts to address systematic exclusion of patients from cancer clinical trials. To broaden eligibility and modernize eligibility to make cancer clinical trials more representative, as you've heard, ASCO and Friends of Cancer Research have led 2 rounds of eligibility criteria recommendations, which include, in the first round, published in 2017, a joint research statement and 4 workgroup manuscripts addressing these issues published in the JCO. A second round has recently been completed and will be disseminated over the course of the next month, which addressed additional eligibility criteria through a joint research statement, 4 additional working group manuscripts, and an impact analysis. And it's important to note that 2 of the working groups, one from the first round, which was the organ dysfunction, prior and concurrent malignancies and comorbidities working group, and one from the second round of this project, the performance status working group, are critically important in increasing eligibility for our older adults to cancer clinical trials. Importantly, in July 2020, the FDA issued a draft guidance to industry specifically on cancer clinical trial eligibility criteria for patients with organ dysfunction or prior or concurrent malignancies. It is important at this point not just to reflect on progress, but to create a sense of urgency to continue progress to improve the evidence base for older adults. While there have been concerted multi-stakeholder efforts to improve the evidence base, we recognize that barriers continue to exist. As recently as 2019, a report was published evaluating age disparities among cancer clinical trial participants, which included over 300 phase 3 randomized controlled trials representing over 250,000 participants for the most common cancer types. And this report showed that trial participants were on average 6.5 years younger than the population median for each disease. And importantly, and most concerning, the gap between trial age and population age was increasing over time. So moving forward, we must overcome barriers to execute recommendations through multi-stakeholder engagement to close the evidence gap rapidly. To do so, we must address challenges related to patient-centric trial design, access to trials, complexity of trials, designing older trials specifically for older adults, characterizing frailty in clinical trials, enrolling pre-frail and frail older adults to registration trials. We must address concerns related to excess toxicity and incentives for enrolling and post-marketing commitments. For the remainder of this session and the workshop, discussions will focus not just on what needs to be done, but importantly on how to do it. Thank you for your attention. I will now reintroduce Dr. Harpreet Singh to lead the panel discussion.